"Sir, I can get your mother to walk again," Maid's daughter said to Billionaire. What she did next. The finest medical minds had surrendered. Michael Walker, a successful businessman who once led major technology conferences in Boston, a man who could buy anything in the world except time, now stood in stillness beside his mother's wheelchair. In a dim room soaked in the yellow hush of an aging Asheville home, his mother, Evelyn Walker, once a brilliant music teacher, now sat as a quiet shadow of who she had once been. And then, from the far end of a hallway lined with worn stone and too little light, a 12-year-old girl stepped out. She was not a doctor. She had no reason to be there. "I can help her walk again, sir," she said, clutching tightly to a leather-bound notebook whose corners were frayed and pages yellowed with time. What happens when the last glimmer of hope comes not from a hospital, but from an unexpected voice? And what if that voice, against every doubt and every odd, is right? Michael could no longer remember when he last returned to Asheville. The old house where he grew up sat nestled in a pine forest, hidden behind rows of maple trees now ablaze with the red fire of autumn. Since his father passed, the house had been Evelyn's alone. She once held concerts for the community, taught hundreds of children how to touch their first piano key. But now, she sat silently by the living room window, eyes lost in the distance, gazing into a garden once bright with roses, now withered and grey. The stroke had come 6 months ago. It stole her voice, robbed her of movement in half her body. Every doctor said the same thing. There was nothing more to be done. Let her rest. Michael had flown home the moment he received the call from Dr. Reed. Everything happened too quickly. One day she was texting him, asking if he would be home for Thanksgiving. The next, news of her stroke struck like lightning out of a clear sky. The trip from Boston to Asheville took nearly 2.5 hours by air, and then another hour and a half by car. Through the entire journey, guilt gripped him like a vice. He had buried himself in work for too long, believing quick phone calls and expensive gifts were enough. But now, as he stood and saw his mother sitting there, her clouded eyes fixed on a painting she no longer seemed to recognize, he understood how wrong he had been, and how late. The house was eerily quiet. No more music rose from the old piano. No more children's laughter drifted down the hallway. No sound of clippers trimming the back garden. Only the slow, steady ticking of the grandfather clock on the wall and the soft whisper of wind outside the window. Michael stood near the glass, hands gripping the chair rail, watching her. Evelyn had once been a woman of unshakable strength, raising 2 children on her own after being widowed, never once complaining. Now she was a frail figure in an oversized sweater, a thin scarf laid across her knees. Linda, the longtime gardener, still came by to tend the plants and keep things clean. Today, she brought her daughter Emily along, as school was closed for a teacher conference. Emily was a quiet girl with bright eyes and hair tied neatly back with a faded cloth band. Michael had noticed her earlier, sitting perfectly still at the end of the hall, arms wrapped around a thick notebook, never once reaching for a phone like other kids her age. When Dr. Reed left, his words once again a cold final echo of "let things take their course," Michael all but gave up. He lowered his head beside his mother's hand and whispered in despair, "I'm sorry, Mum. I can't do any more." And then a voice, small but unwavering, spoke behind him. "I can help her walk again." Michael turned sharply. Emily stood in the doorway, notebook held close to her chest. Linda rushed forward, flustered, pulling at her daughter's arm, apologizing through nervous stammers. "She doesn't know what she's saying, Mr. Walker. Please forgive her." But Michael raised a hand to stop her. He looked directly into the girl's eyes. Something in them made him pause. It wasn't childish naivety. It was a quiet certainty, as though she truly believed what she said. He asked, "Why do you think you can do what the best doctors couldn't?" Emily raised her chin and opened the notebook. The pages were aged, filled with handwritten notes and intricate sketches of muscle systems, pressure points, and fine blue ink annotations. "My grandfather was an army medic," Emily said. "He taught me a method. It doesn't use machines, just hands, memory, and heart." No one spoke. For a few seconds, the room seemed to stop breathing. Michael looked at his mother. She hadn't moved, but her eyes no longer seemed distant. He felt it, something subtle but real, a change. Then he turned back to Emily. "Then let's begin," he said. "We have nothing left to lose." Before we continue with this strange yet deeply moving story, if you're listening and feel something stirring deep within your heart, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone you care about. Here at Emotional Echoes, we strive to bring you stories that reach into the soul, awaken belief, and nurture kindness every single day. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment with the name of your city, state, or country so we can know just how far these stories have traveled across the world. And now, let us return to the story of Michael, Evelyn, and the young girl named Emily, where miracles may begin in the simplest of places. The living room of the old house, nestled deep within the pine woods of Asheville, held its heavy silence, as if even the walls had paused to absorb the words spoken by a 12-year-old girl. Michael wasn't sure what had possessed him when he said, "Then let's begin," as though he had just surrendered control of the situation to a child. And yet, strangely, he didn't regret it. On the contrary, he felt lighter than he had since first returning home. Linda gently tugged at her daughter's sleeve, whispering something with a trembling voice, but Emily only shook her head, her gaze fixed on Evelyn, who remained motionless by the window. Michael did not wait for them to leave, as he typically did with hired help. Instead, he returned to the armchair beside his mother, the one Dr. Reed had vacated less than 10 minutes earlier. The doctor's words still echoed in his mind, each syllable cold and final, like a sentence with no appeal. At her age, with this degree of muscular atrophy and nerve damage, walking again is not possible. Focus on quality of life. Let her be at peace. He had heard variations of the same conclusion from countless doctors over the past 6 months. They came, they examined, they diagnosed, they prescribed, and then they left, as though he were the only one too, stubborn to accept that miracles do not exist. And with each visit, the thread of hope inside him thinned until it was barely a whisper of belief, clinging to the faint idea that his mother might awaken, might speak again, might smile, might one day walk into the garden and gather roses the way she once did. Evelyn still sat there, the soft grey wool blanket folded neatly over her lap, her face tilted slightly toward the pale light streaming through the wide window pane. Her thin hands rested gently on her thighs, fingers curved as if once accustomed to dancing across piano keys, but now withdrawn into silence. Michael let his eyes wander across the familiar details of the room he had once known, like the back of his hand. The photograph of his parents on their wedding day. The grandfather clock his father used to polish every Sunday morning. The piano, now dust-covered, waiting in the corner like an old friend long forgotten. Everything felt suspended in time, as if waiting for something to stir them back to life. As a child, Michael had been a dreamer, enchanted by music, and the long afternoons spent listening to his mother play and sing. But life had carried him to Boston, into the relentless current of an executive's world, a man ruled by meetings and numbers. In recent years, the calls had grown fewer, the visits home even rarer. He had always assumed she was fine. Evelyn had always been strong, always tucked away her exhaustion, never wanting to burden her children. Until the day the phone rang and the nurse's voice said plainly, "Mrs. Evelyn Walker has been admitted to emergency. It may be a stroke." In those first days, Michael dropped everything. He sat at her side. When she woke after 2 days in a coma, unable to speak, unable to focus her eyes, unresponsive, he felt his world fracture. But the doctors reassured him. They said it would take time. She needed therapy. He spared no expense, hired the best specialists, purchased the most advanced recovery equipment, moved her to a renowned medical center in Charlotte. Week after week, month after month, he asked, "Is there any improvement?" And each time the answer was, "We're doing our best." 6 months passed. His mother still could not walk, could not speak, could not smile. Only her eyes, on certain days, seemed to hold the weight of something unspoken, as though she were trying to reach him through a barrier neither of them could cross. Recent assessments began to include a new phrase, irreversible damage, and today Dr. Reed, a man who had once been a close family friend, had delivered his final clinical verdict. "Michael, it's time for you to accept this." Michael heard every word, but his heart refused to obey. How could he accept this ending for the woman who had raised 2 children alone, who had taught him how to rise after failure, who had never once let go of him in his darkest hours, and now was being asked to let go of herself, as though she were nothing more than a case number with no more use? And then Emily appeared, not with a white coat or a laptop full of diagnostic images, but with nothing more than her small hands and an old notebook. Part of Michael wanted to dismiss it, to tell the girl that life wasn't a fairy tale. But another part of him, the part worn thin by exhaustion and despair, yet still clinging to a faint ember of belief, could not turn away. He looked at Evelyn again. And in that moment, he swore he saw her eyelid flutter ever so slightly when Emily entered. Perhaps it was a reflex. Perhaps it was his imagination. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was the first sign of something greater. And Michael decided then and there that he would not ignore even a single thread of the chance that remained. Because sometimes hope doesn't arrive from where you expect. It comes from the corner of a quiet hallway where a young girl stands holding a worn notebook that carries a promise no one else dares to. Believe. Michael stood frozen, eyes fixed on the girl, clutching the notebook as if it were a treasure. Emily's words echoed in his mind like something impossible. In 6 long months, not a single doctor, not one therapist, not any professional had ever dared to offer even the suggestion of a promise. They brought numbers, clinical data, carefully outlined reasons why recovery wasn't possible. Yet this child, wearing scuffed shoes and a faded dress, stood upright in the cold quiet of the room and said the one thing every grown-up had long stopped allowing themselves to hope for. Linda hadn't moved. She seemed caught between silencing her daughter and questioning whether she'd heard her correctly. Michael quietly stepped forward, drawn to the strange calm that radiated from the girl, a calm that seemed to hold its own truth. He sat across from her, between them a worn wooden table, on which still rested the cooling cup of tea Dr. Reed had left behind. "What did you just say?" Michael asked, his voice low but steady. Emily swallowed and held the notebook tighter to her chest. "I said, I believe I can help Mrs. Evelyn Walker again." Linda gasped and rushed forward, nearly pleading, "Mr. Walker, please forgive her. She reads too many strange books and has a wild imagination." She meant no offense, but Michael didn't look at Linda. He kept his gaze fixed on Emily. "Are you serious?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Very serious." Michael drew in a slow breath. "You're not a doctor. You're 12 years old. Where does that kind of certainty come from?" Emily opened the notebook. The pages were yellowed, dog-eared, filled with small, careful handwriting and detailed sketches of muscle groups and pressure points. "My grandfather wrote this," she said. "He was an army medic. He worked in a veterans hospital. He helped soldiers who couldn't walk after the war." Michael scanned the faded ink, the handwritten annotations. "You understand all of this?" Emily pressed her lips together. "Not everything yet, but my grandfather taught me piece by piece since I was 8. Before he passed, he said I was the only one in the family with hands patient enough to learn. I remember everything he showed me. Linda jumped in. She only played with it, sir. She never touched anyone. I never allowed it. Michael nodded slowly, eyes still on the notebook. A part of him still questioned whether he was losing his mind, sitting here listening to a child speak of healing in place of a trained medical team. But the rest of him could not look away. "What is it you want to do?" he asked. Emily turned to a page marked with a strip of red fabric. "I need to check the blood flow in her legs, to see if the nerves still respond. If they do, it means they're not completely dead. Just asleep." "Did you learn that from books?" Michael asked. "No, from my grandfather. He called it listening with your hands." Michael sat in silence. Evelyn had not moved, but her eyes, he would swear to it, were no longer vacant. "And if you're wrong?" Michael asked. "If you cause her pain?" Emily looked directly into his eyes. "I'll stop immediately. I won't go beyond what I know. I'm not replacing the doctors. But if I'm right, this might be her last chance." Michael turned to his mother. Her face was still like stone, but her eyes, there was light. He looked back at Linda. "I want to try." Linda's mouth fell open. "Mr. Walker, please think this through. If anything happens, I take full responsibility," Michael said firmly. "And if something comes of this, then it was your granddaughter who did what no one else dared." Emily did not smile. She didn't seem excited. She only nodded, as if she had just been handed a task she had long been waiting to fulfill. "I need a warm towel, some olive oil, and a low stool." Linda was still in shock, but Michael had already stood. "I'll get them." As he stepped toward the kitchen, for the first time in many months, his heart beat quickly for a reason that had nothing to do with fear or grief. It was because of something he had not allowed himself to name in far too long. Hope. Michael returned to the living room carrying a warm towel that was still lightly steaming, a bottle of olive oil from the kitchen, and a low stool he had just pulled from the dining room. Emily had placed the old notebook on the coffee table, its worn corners flipped open to familiar pages, and her fingers traced each line as if following a path back through memory. Linda stood behind her, keeping a respectful distance, but never taking her eyes off her daughter, her expression caught somewhere between fear and awe. Evelyn sat quietly in her wheelchair, her eyes gently blinking when Michael placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "We're going to try something new, Mum." Emily took her seat on the small stool, just the right height to bring her level with Evelyn's legs. She poured a few drops of oil into her palm and began rubbing her hands together slowly, warming the oil with patient friction. "I won't hurt you, Grandma," she murmured, not just to calm Evelyn, but perhaps to calm herself as well. "Grandpa always said, pressing harder doesn't mean it's better. You have to listen to what the body is saying." Michael sat down beside them, his gaze fixed on every small movement Emily made. She placed her thumb on Evelyn's right ankle, closed her eyes, and held it there for a few quiet seconds. She didn't rub, didn't press, just placed and waited. Then, slowly, she moved her thumb up toward the knee, then down again to the arch of the foot. Her touch was so gentle that Michael felt as if she was speaking through her hands to the still, silent body of his mother. "My grandpa served in the Second World War," Emily said, her eyes still closed. "When the war ended, he didn't leave the field hospital. He stayed to help wounded soldiers heal. Back then, there were no machines like we have now, no strong electricity, no fancy medicine. Just hot water, cotton towels, and a pair of hands." Michael nodded, his eyes drifting toward the notebook. "You seem to remember a lot." Emily opened her eyes slightly and smiled. "I don't remember," I learned. "Every night, Grandpa would sit by my bed and read a few lines from this notebook. He said that if someday no one remembered him, at least there would be a granddaughter who carried his hands." Michael ran his fingers across the cover. The old leather was soft like a winter coat worn through many long seasons. "Do you really think this still works?" Emily looked up. Not all of it, but some things about the body don't change. Grandpa said the nervous system is like a network of roads. When war destroys the roads, they may fall apart, but if you're patient, you can build new bridges. Linda wiped her hands on her apron and stepped a little closer. She has a memory like a camera. Whatever she reads, she remembers. But I never thought she'd use it for this. Emily said nothing more. She shifted to Evelyn's left leg, repeating the same quiet movements. Her eyes stayed fixed on the smallest reactions in Evelyn's skin. After a few minutes, she whispered, "The blood here moves slow, very slow. But it's not gone." Michael frowned. "How can you tell?" Emily pointed to a spot near the ankle. "There's a slight tremble under the skin, like a lazy pulse. Grandpa called it a sleeping pulse." She stopped her hands, opened the notebook, and showed Michael a section marked with faded blue ink. This is where Grandpa wrote about a patient named Charles. He was paralyzed on one side after a tank accident. The doctors said there was no hope, but Grandpa didn't believe them. He started with the legs. Every day, 7 minutes on each one. No rubbing, no pulling, just placing his hands and sharing his energy. "And then?" Michael asked. 3 months later, Charles moved a toe. A year later, he stood up on his own. Michael fell silent, his mind whirling between disbelief and wonder. What Emily described didn't sound like anything he had heard from hospitals or doctors, but it also didn't feel like fantasy. Her words were full of images, of process, of real people. Emily placed both hands on Evelyn's knees and sat still for a few seconds, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. "I think there's still a chance," she said. "If Grandma Evelyn is willing and not afraid." Michael turned to look at his mother. Evelyn didn't speak, but her eyes were now clearly focused on Emily, no longer distant. As if, through the thick fog of time, a small shaft of light had begun to break through. "Are you ready to do this every day?" Michael asked. Emily nodded. "I don't promise a miracle, but I promise I won't give up." Michael looked at his mother again, then at the girl seated before her. He had never believed a child could carry the legacy of war, the patience of an old healer, and the courage of a young warrior. But now, he did. And he decided to walk with her into a journey no one else had dared begin. Because whether or not miracles were real, he knew one thing with certainty. For the first time in many months, his mother was no longer left alone in the silence. The light in the living room had softened now, as if the house itself had begun to listen. Emily sat quietly on the low stool, her small hands resting gently on Evelyn's knees. Every movement in the room was unhurried, as though time no longer passed in its usual way here. Michael stood behind his mother, his hand resting on her shoulder, partly to comfort her, partly seeking something solid to hold onto himself. Linda still stood near the doorway, her fingers clenched around the edge of her apron, her gaze a mix of doubt and fear, but she no longer tried to stop anything. The words Emily had spoken about her grandfather, about toes that had once awakened after war, echoed through Michael's mind like a strange and haunting melody that would not end. Nothing the girl did resembled any therapy he had ever hired for his mother. There were no wires, no machines, no steady beeps from monitors measuring pulses or reflexes. There was only a child's hands and the quiet rhythm of her breathing as she carried out something no one had thought to take seriously. Emily opened her eyes, and her blue gaze now held no trace of hesitation. She gently moved the warm towel aside, now cooled, and placed 2 fingers onto the sole of Evelyn's right foot. She didn't rub, didn't press. She just held, as if searching for some hidden signal beneath the fragile surface of the skin. Michael felt his throat tighten. No one spoke. The air in the room stretched thin, so taut that a single sound might have shattered it. Evelyn did not respond. Her eyes still stared forward, unmoving, unblinking. But Emily was in no rush. She moved her fingers along the top of the foot, then stopped at the ankle. "The pulse is weak, but it's still there," she whispered, as if speaking only to herself. "It's like an electric wire covered in dust. You clean it off, and the light can come back." Michael furrowed his brow. "How can you know that?" Emily didn't look up. "Grandpa said a pulse doesn't just beat, it hums. If you're patient, you can feel its slower rhythm, like listening to the heartbeat of someone deep in sleep." She took a little more oil, warming it between her palms with deliberate calm. There was no rush, not a single wasted motion. She laid her hand on Evelyn's lower leg, her fingertips pressing gently into precise points, following a sequence that seemed etched deep into her memory. "What are you doing?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm waking the muscles," Emily answered. "Muscles don't die. They just forget how to respond. I have to send a signal to the brain to remind it the legs are still here." Linda took one cautious step forward, then stopped again. The room remained still, filled only with the soft hiss of wind against the window and the faint crackle from the fireplace. Emily shifted slightly, then suddenly paused. "Wait," she said softly. "I just felt—" She placed her fingers back on Evelyn's ankle, tilting her head as if trying to hear something invisible. Michael instinctively leaned closer. "What did you feel?" he asked under his breath. Emily didn't answer right away. She placed both hands around Evelyn's ankle and held them there in silence. And then, something so small happened it felt almost imagined. A tremor, light as a butterfly's wing, passed through Evelyn's right pinky toe. It moved, ever so slightly, a faint twitch, but unmistakable. Michael stopped breathing. He turned to Linda. "Did you see that?" Linda raised a hand to her mouth. "I saw it. I swear I saw it." Emily pulled her hands back, her eyes still fixed on Evelyn's foot. The muscle responded. "It's weak, but it's alive." Michael felt as though his heart had dropped from his chest. 6 months. 6 months of nothing. So many treatments, so many experts, so many moments of hope turned to dust. And now, in a matter of minutes, a 12-year-old girl with an old notebook had done what the entire medical system could not. Evelyn did not speak. She didn't move again. But her eyes had shifted downward. She was looking at Emily. Not vaguely, not distantly. She was truly looking. Michael felt it in every hair on his body. He dropped to one knee beside her. "Mum, can you feel anything?" Evelyn didn't respond with words, but her hand, still frail, closed slightly around the arm of the chair. Emily looked up, her voice still steady, but warm like the start of a flame. "I think she's ready. If we keep going, we might see more tomorrow." Michael looked at his mother, then at the girl beside her. In that moment, he no longer saw a child. He saw a teacher, someone who carried the memory of a generation before, the belief of someone still here, and the courage to dream of something no one else dared to believe. And he whispered, not sure to whom the words were meant, "Keep going, don't stop." The living room of the house, nestled deep in the pine forest, seemed to hold its breath. All sound had faded into silence after the faint motion of Evelyn's toe. It was the smallest of movements, so delicate it might have vanished if someone had blinked, yet to Michael it struck like a silent explosion, shaking the foundation of everything he had once believed to be certain. 6 long months of doctors' voices, sterile reports, quiet headshakes, all of it now seemed to dissolve under the quiet presence of a 12-year-old girl with small hands and eyes full of quiet determination. Emily sat still, not moving from her place. She didn't cry out, didn't celebrate. She simply lifted her head and looked at Evelyn, as if needing to confirm that what she had just felt had truly happened. Michael remained kneeling beside them, his eyes filled with emotion, but his lips pressed tight, as if afraid that breathing too hard might scatter the fragile miracle before them. Linda stepped back, her eyes shining with tears. In all her years working in this house, she had never seen her employer like this. A man who had once spoken before hundreds, who had signed contracts worth millions, now sat on the wooden floor, holding his mother's hand like a boy who had just found a lost toy he had long thought gone forever. Evelyn still did not speak, but her gaze was no longer empty. There was something behind it, a shard of awareness, a trace of presence, a sign that she was still here, still listening, still feeling. Michael gently tightened his grip on her hand and whispered, "I know you hear me. You're still here with me." Then he turned to Emily. "Do you think it could happen again? I mean, her toe, could it move again?" Emily nodded slowly. "I can't say when, but a response like that is a good sign. The important thing is to keep going. Don't let the muscles fall back asleep." Michael nodded, his mind filled with hazy images. His mother walking through the garden, pruning shears in hand, her smile wide under the morning sun. That image had always belonged to memory, but now, suddenly, it felt like a possibility. And what moved him more than anything else was that this possibility hadn't come from an expensive surgery or a cutting-edge machine. It came from the hands of a young girl, following the memory and love passed down from her grandfather. A soft breeze slipped through the cracked window. The linen curtain stirred, making a faint rustling sound, so soft that no one would have noticed unless they were listening closely. But it was then that something else, equally quiet and astonishing, happened. Evelyn blinked, not once, but twice in a row. Michael froze. He leaned in. "Mom, did you just blink?" Emily stood and walked around to the other side. "She hears, maybe not clearly yet, but she's reacting to sound and to touch. She's finding her way back." Michael took his mother's hand in his. The hand that had once felt cold and soft like cotton now stirred faintly, in a way almost too subtle to believe. "Mom, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. And then Evelyn's thumb pressed gently into the center of his palm. Linda gasped, a sound caught between a sob and a cry of disbelief. Emily didn't smile. She simply stood there, still and quiet, watching the elderly woman slowly reclaim pieces of herself the world had long declared lost. Michael had no words. He lowered his head and pressed a kiss to his mother's hand, then looked up toward the ceiling, as if sending a silent prayer of gratitude to his father, to fate, to whatever force had brought Emily into their lives. And then, in the hush that held the room like glass, a sound broke through, small, sharp, like a blade slicing through stillness. It was Evelyn's voice, so faint it could have been mistaken for breath, but it wasn't. It was a real sound, fragile, broken, but unmistakably formed in her throat. "Emily!" Michael nearly jumped to his feet. He turned to the girl. Emily had placed her hand over her chest, her eyes wide in stunned recognition. Evelyn had spoken her name. No one said a word, but in that moment they all understood. This was no longer luck, no longer a passing flicker of coincidence. This was a signal. The first bell ringing out, warning that something larger was approaching, and it had begun with a single touch, a glance, a name spoken through the dark. In a room that had once felt like a tomb, still and heavy with silence, sound had returned. And this time, no one doubted anymore. Evelyn Walker was coming back. The next morning, Michael woke earlier than usual. Sleep had eluded him after what had happened the night before. Over and over, his mind replayed the image of his mother's foot twitching, her thumb pressing gently into his palm, and her voice, faint and broken, rising from a body the doctors had long declared unresponsive. The house was quiet in the early light, but the silence no longer felt mournful. It was the kind of stillness that comes just before music begins, full of anticipation and hope. Michael stepped into the living room, where Evelyn still sat in her familiar wheelchair, her face turned slightly toward the window. But now, her gaze was no longer distant. It had a focus, a quiet spark of life. Emily had arrived early. She sat cross-legged on the rug, her hands wrapped around the worn notebook. Linda was in the kitchen preparing warm water and biscuits, as she always did. No one spoke loudly. Everyone moved as though afraid to disturb something fragile and newly returned. Emily looked up at Michael as he entered and gave a small nod. "Today, we're going to try something new," she said softly. "Music." Michael blinked in surprise. "You're going to play something for her?" Emily rose and walked toward the old piano in the corner of the room. "I think she'll remember what's familiar. If we can stir memory through sound, maybe the brain will respond more quickly. My grandfather used to say that when the body stops listening, music can still find its way in." Michael looked at the piano. How long had it sat untouched? He remembered his mother sitting there in the late afternoons, playing classical pieces, gentle melodies he had once tuned out without thought. Now, every note from those memories returned with new clarity. Emily lifted the lid, gently testing a few keys. The tones that came out were soft and a bit uneven, the piano long out of tune, but it still had something left to give. It wasn't dead. She began to play a simple melody. It wasn't grand or complicated, just a few repeating notes, something that sounded like an old lullaby. Michael didn't recognize the tune, but he saw his mother's eyes begin to change. Evelyn looked at Emily. Then her gaze moved to the piano. Slowly her right hand gave a faint tremble, a soft vibration like the body trying to say, "I remember. I know this song." Emily kept playing, now shifting into a gentle chorus. The melody became clearer, sharper, as if unlocking a door long sealed shut. Evelyn exhaled a breath, deeper than before, then turned her head slightly toward the sound. Michael stepped forward, kneeling beside her. "Do you remember, Mom? You used to play this every afternoon. Every time I came home from school, you'd be here playing. I didn't listen then, but I'm listening now, Mum. I'm really listening." Emily stopped after the chorus and walked toward Evelyn, taking her hand and placing it gently on the piano keys. Evelyn didn't pull away. Her hand was still weak, but it responded. Michael held his breath. Emily said quietly, "You don't have to play the whole song. Just one key. Just one note." Evelyn looked at her hand. Slowly, delicately, she pressed down on a key. A single note rang out. One solitary sound, but it pierced through the walls of the house, threading its way into every forgotten corner where life had once faded. Michael closed his eyes. His heart pounded like it hadn't since boyhood, when he'd witnessed something too incredible to name. When he opened them, Emily was smiling. Not the carefree smile of a child, but the quiet, knowing smile of someone who had just seen belief become real. Linda stepped from the kitchen carrying a tray, but froze when she saw what was happening. On Evelyn's lips was the softest curve, a smile, faint and small, but unmistakably a smile. Michael rose and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You just brought back a whole piece of time we thought we'd lost." Emily shook her head. "It wasn't me." She came back. Music was just the invitation. Outside the window, morning light filtered through the pines, falling in dappled patterns across the wooden floor. In a room once filled with nothing but wind and silence, there was now music, there was movement, there was the first note played by someone once thought to have left this world behind. And Michael knew without question they had just stepped onto the first stretch of a long road ahead. But this time, they would not walk it alone. Evelyn had heard. She had reached out. She had remembered. And she had played a note in the song of her life once more. That afternoon, the atmosphere in the Walker house felt as if it had been infused with a new breath of life. Evelyn had drifted into sleep after her session with Emily, but this time it was True rest, light and peaceful, no longer the hollow unconsciousness that had defined the past long months. Michael gently pulled a thin blanket over his mother's legs and stepped away from the living room, where the slanting afternoon light had begun to stretch across the wooden floor in long, golden shadows. He walked slowly toward the back garden, the place that had once been his mother's favorite space. The lavender beds had gone wild now, untamed and overgrown. A few old rose bushes clung to life, their branches scraggly but still reaching, and there, beneath the great red maple, he saw Linda and Emily sitting together. They weren't speaking. They simply sat, side by side, in the soft hush of late-day light. The last rays of sun spilled over the girl's dark brown hair, catching on its strands until it shimmered like copper thread. Emily was holding a small sprig of wild daisies, quietly weaving it into a delicate ring. Linda turned when she heard footsteps and gave a slight nod. The hesitation and guardedness from those early days were gone. Between them now was a wordless understanding, the kind that needed no explanation. Michael lowered himself beside Emily, drawing in a long breath of damp earth, fresh grass, and the crisp chill of early fall. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he'd forgotten, the feeling of being truly alive, of being present. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "Not just for my mother, but for this house. You woke it up." Emily didn't lift her head. She continued braiding the petals. "I'm not sure I did much," she said. "I just listened. Mrs. Evelyn's body was saying a lot. Grown-ups just don't usually hear it." Michael let out a soft laugh, but there was something restrained behind it, a quiet ache. Grown-ups stay busy with fear, afraid of being wrong, afraid of hoping, afraid of believing in things that aren't certain. Emily placed the little daisy ring into her palm. "My grandpa said, if everyone waited for certainty before acting, no one would ever dare to heal anything, because healing starts with trust." Linda gave her daughter's shoulder a gentle squeeze, her eyes bright. For the first time, Michael truly saw the quiet strength Linda had carried beside his mother all these years. She wasn't just the gardener. She had been the keeper of warmth in this house, even when those who owned it had let it go cold. "Linda," Michael said softly, "why didn't you tell me sooner? About Emily, about her grandfather." "I feel like I've missed something important for a very long time," Linda answered slowly, her eyes still on the withered flower pots. "Because I didn't think you were ready to hear it. And because she'd never done this for anyone outside the family. Not until she saw Mrs. Evelyn." Emily lifted her face then, for the first time looking Michael directly in the eye. "I didn't plan to help," she said. "I was afraid. But when I looked at her, I saw my grandpa near the end of his life. There was still something left unsaid. I didn't want anyone to be forgotten like that." Michael was silent. Those words didn't belong to a child. They belonged to a soul that had walked through loss and had learned how to place its hands on pain without making it worse. He looked at the small hand resting quietly in Linda's, mother and daughter, one hand continuing another, a passing of something that went deeper than blood. It was love, woven not from duty but from attention, shared glances, and small acts, done with a full heart. "Tomorrow," Michael said, his voice soft. "Could you come a little earlier? My mum, she might want to play again." Emily smiled. "I'll bring a different song, the one she used to play most often. I found it in an old drawer." Michael raised his eyebrows. "You know how to read sheet music?" "Not very well," she replied, "but my grandpa used to make me write every note by hand. He said if you write it yourself, the sound stays longer in your memory." Linda let out a laugh, her first in many days. It rang out light and clear through the quiet garden, as though autumn itself had found a way to warm their hearts again. Michael looked at them. A mother, a child, one generation placing its hand into the next. and he suddenly understood that miracles don't always arrive in thunderclaps or bright lights. Sometimes they come from the hands of a girl braiding flowers under a red maple tree, where past, present, and future quietly meet. And that was enough to make the world, no matter how uncertain, worth trusting again. The next morning, early sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a gentle wash of pale gold across the wooden floor of the living room. Michael had been awake for hours, but gone was the heaviness that used to greet him at dawn. In its place was something quietly electric, like the expectancy of a post-child on Christmas morning. In the kitchen, Linda was making tea for Evelyn. Ever since the older woman had started responding again, Linda had been carefully preparing each morning as if it were a quiet ritual, a way of gently welcoming the day. The house itself seemed to breathe differently now, softer, warmer, and in that subtle shift, Michael felt something he hadn't known in years' life. Emily arrived earlier than usual. She carried with her a piece of music, handwritten on a worn sheet of paper. It was the song Michael's mother had once played more than any other. No one remembered its name, but its melody seemed to live in the very walls of the house. When Emily entered the room, she didn't speak loudly, didn't disturb the soft stillness that hung like morning mist around Evelyn. She walked straight to the piano, opened its lid, and placed the sheet on the stand. Michael sat beside his mother. Evelyn's gaze was no longer drifting. She looked directly toward the descent piano, her lips gently pressed together, her hand resting on the armrest with quiet control. Emily began to play. The opening notes were simple, unadorned, a melody that sounded like a whisper from the past. Michael couldn't say for certain if his mother was remembering, but he saw something shift in her. A longer blink, a subtle tilt of the head. Then, as the melody rose toward its quiet climax, the impossible happened again. Evelyn lifted her right hand. Not much, but enough to rise from the armrest, deliberate and searching. Michael gasped, his eyes wide. "Mom," he whispered, "you're lifting your hand." Evelyn didn't speak, but her hand remained suspended, hovering as if reaching for something she once knew. Emily stopped playing at just the right moment. Silence fell, full and expectant. Then, as if a long-buried circuit had just reconnected, Evelyn turned her head toward Michael. Slowly, clearly, she opened her mouth. And what came out was not a moan or a vague breath. It was a word, a real word. Her voice was soft, unsteady like a breeze threading through trees, but distinct as a bell ringing in the woods. "She's helping." 3 words, but they carried the weight of all the months of silence. Michael's knees nearly gave out. He gripped his mother's hand, his eyes clouded with tears. "You're speaking, Mum. You know who Emily is." Emily moved closer, kneeling beside Evelyn's chair. "You hear me?" she asked gently. Evelyn looked at the girl. Her eyes, though dim, held focus. A tear slid down her cheek, as though her entire being was finding its way back from the farthest reaches of forgetting. Linda ran in from the kitchen and stopped short at the sight before her. Michael turned to her, voice raw. She spoke. She just spoke. Linda pressed a hand to her chest, overcome. In all her years of caring for Evelyn, she had never seen anything like this. This was no longer a motionless woman in a chair. This was a mother coming back to her son, a person slowly claiming life from the edge of its end. Emily held Evelyn's hand. Her small fingers curled around the older woman's paper-thin skin with a steadiness far beyond her years. "I'm here," she whispered. "I won't leave." Evelyn didn't respond, but she closed her eyes, not from weariness, but in quiet acceptance, as if letting each word sink deep into a part of her that still remembered what it meant to be known. The room fell silent again. No sound but the beating of Michael's heart in his chest. And he knew, with absolute clarity, this wasn't just a moment of speech. It was a beginning, a signal that she was hearing, thinking, feeling, and most of all, trying. The house was no longer a place waiting for an end. It had become a place bearing witness to a return. Michael looked at Emily. "You're not just helping my mother, you're saving this family." But Emily shook her head. "I'm not saving anyone. I just knocked on the door. She's the one who chose to open it." And Evelyn had opened it. Just a crack. But from within, the light had started to reach out, through her eyes, through her hand, through that first trembling voice. And no one in that house would ever be the same. Because from the moment Evelyn spoke those 3 words, the world inside her and around her had shifted. There was no going back, only forward now. The next morning, as Michael and Emily were quietly preparing a light breakfast for Evelyn, a sound broke the calm at the end of the tree-lined drive. It was subtle at first, the crunch of tires on gravel, then the unmistakable slam of a car door. Michael froze, his chest tightening. Through the kitchen window he saw it, the silver-grey SUV parked just outside the gate. And when the door swung open, the woman who stepped out moved with a familiar, purposeful stride, her honey-blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her eyes sharp and unreadable behind. Dark sunglasses. Sarah, his sister. Sarah had returned from Chicago not out of longing for her mother or any sudden warmth toward her younger brother, but because of the message Michael had sent the night before. Just a single line. Mom spoke. He didn't know why he sent it, or what exactly he hoped would come of it. Maybe he wanted her to believe. Maybe he just needed someone else to witness what he still struggled to believe himself. The front door opened before anyone had the chance to greet her. Heels clacked across the wooden floor. A leather handbag swung from her shoulder. Her eyes scanned the room quickly and landed on the wheelchair where Evelyn sat. "What exactly are you doing here, Michael?" Her voice was cold, stripped of all softness. Michael set the glass of water down and moved toward her. "That was fast," he said. Sarah removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that flickered with suspicion and perhaps something else. "You said Mum spoke." "That's impossible," the doctors confirmed. "You expect me to believe a little gardener cured our mother?" Emily stood silently nearby, her hands tightening around her grandfather's notebook as if holding on to its steadiness. Linda stepped out from the kitchen, her gaze wary. The room had shifted in an instant, tension rising like the air before a storm. Michael drew a long breath. "You don't have to believe me. Just watch." He walked to Evelyn's side and knelt. "Mom, can you hear me? Sarah's here." There was a pause, the kind that made even time seem to wait. Then, slowly, Evelyn turned her head toward him. Her clouded eyes blinked once. And then, like wind slipping through autumn leaves, she spoke. One word. Soft, but unmistakable. "Sarah." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah didn't move, her mouth parted, eyes wide. "Did she just say my name?" Her voice dropped, unsure for the first time. Michael nodded. "She started speaking yesterday. Not just speaking. She's aware. She hears us. She's coming back." Sarah stepped back, almost as if the floor had shifted beneath her. No, that's not possible. Maybe it's a reflex. Or, you're imagining things." Her gaze turned to Emily, sharp with scrutiny. "And who are you? Why are you here every day? Who gave you permission to touch my mother?" Michael stepped between them. "Emily is Linda's daughter." She was the first to notice Mom could still respond. It was her hands, her patience, that sparked the first sign we'd seen in 6 months. Without her, we'd still believe Mom was lost to us. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "A child? Are you serious? We've had doctors, therapists, state-of-the-art equipment, and you let a child do what science said was impossible?" Linda stepped forward, her voice calm but unshakable. "Miss Sarah, I've never seen anyone believe in Evelyn the way Emily does. She didn't hurt her. She only touched the places grown-ups are too afraid to believe are still alive." Sarah clutched her bag tighter. I need to call a doctor. Someone qualified. This could be a violation of medical care laws. Michael exhaled. Call whoever you want, but let Mum decide. Ask her. Ask her if she wants Emily to stay. Sarah turned slowly to Evelyn. The older woman's eyes were already on the girl. And then, for the second time, her voice emerged, thin, trembling, but steady enough to make the walls themselves feel like they were listening. Stay. Just 2 words. But they were the clearest decision Evelyn had made since the stroke, and in that moment the room seemed to hold its breath again, not from fear, but from awe. Because no one, not even Sarah, could argue with the truth spoken in that voice. Evelyn Walker had chosen. She had reached across the distance of silence and pulled someone in. And that someone was a 12-year-old girl with nothing but a notebook, a memory, and hands that dared to believe. Sarah said nothing more. She turned and walked quickly down the hallway, leaving behind a room that had just weathered a quiet, emotional storm. Michael remained still, his eyes following his sister's retreating figure. He didn't blame her. Sarah had always lived by reason, but it was that same commitment to logic that had made her forget there are things that exist beyond science, beyond control. And today, she had seen one of them. Evelyn had spoken her name. Evelyn had chosen to stay. Evelyn had begun to speak again, and all of it had started with something almost impossibly simple, a small hand, an old song, and the unwavering belief of a 12-year-old girl named Emily. 2 days after Sarah's arrival, Dr. Reed appeared at the cabin in the woods like a gust of winter wind. He wore a long grey coat, the collar turned up, nearly swallowing a plaid scarf tucked underneath. The way he knocked 3 steady, firm raps was exactly as it had been during the 6 months of weekly visits while Evelyn lay still and silent. But this time, the look in his eyes held not just the exhaustion of a seasoned physician, but something cautious, guarded. Sarah followed close behind, her voice as sharp as ever. I've requested an independent medical assessment. She's still a patient. She still needs supervision. Michael didn't argue. He stepped aside to let Dr. Reed pass, his expression calm, though something deep inside him vibrated with resistance. Emily sat beside Evelyn, quietly reading aloud, one hand resting gently on the back of the older woman's hand. At the sight of Dr. Reed, she stood without a word and stepped back beside Linda, who was watching from across the room with quiet attentiveness. Dr. Reed placed his leather bag on the table, removed his gloves, and looked directly at Evelyn. He said nothing at first. He simply approached her, leaned in slightly, and studied the face that had once been an immobile fixture in his routine, a face he had grown used to seeing without reaction. Mrs. Walker, he said at last, his voice deliberate and low, if you can hear me, please blink twice. Evelyn blinked, twice. Not slowly, not with hesitation, but with a clarity that required no interpretation. Reed straightened slightly, and in that moment something flickered across his expression. Michael couldn't tell if it was surprise or doubt. The doctor continued, Do you recognize me? Evelyn's gaze fixed on his eyes. Her mouth moved slowly, and then came a single word, quiet but unmistakable. Reed. No explanation, no embellishment, just a name. But it was said clearly enough to silence the room. Sarah turned to look at her brother. Michael didn't meet her eyes. He simply stood there, arms folded across his chest, waiting for the rest of what he already knew was coming. Reed turned back to his bag, retrieving the tools of his trade, the reflex hammer, the blood pressure cuff, a small light to test pupil reaction. He moved through the examination with methodical precision, silent, detached, letting no emotion disturb the clarity of his assessment. He checked muscle tone, subtle motor responses, slight shifts in Evelyn's posture. For nearly 20 minutes, he worked without comment. Then, with a long breath, He closed the bag and turned to Michael. "I'll admit," he began, his voice low, professional, "Mrs. Evelyn is exhibiting stronger responses than before. Some autonomic reflexes have returned. That suggests the central nervous system is still showing signs of connectivity." Sarah jumped in immediately, her voice sharp with urgency. "So she's recovering?" Reed shook his head slowly, and his tone dropped, each word landing with deliberate weight. "Not exactly. These reflexes could be mechanical. The fact that she's spoken a few words may be tied to memory recall or isolated nerve triggers, but no one can say for certain that it indicates conscious, cognitive recovery." Michael stepped forward. "She said my sister's name. She chose Emily. She expressed what she wanted clearly." Reed didn't flinch. "And I've had patients call out to people who'd been dead 30 years. Others who could recite full songs, word for word, yet didn't recognize their own sons. The brain is a complex system, Michael. What you're seeing might be a final burst of activity before it shuts down completely." In the corner of the room, Emily stood silent. She couldn't understand every medical term being tossed around, but her eyes were unwavering. She had seen Evelyn blink, grip her hand, smile. She had felt life pushing back through the silence. That kind of knowing didn't come from textbooks. Reed turned to Emily, then glanced at Linda. "I've been told this young girl initiated a form of unsupervised physical contact. No certification, no training. Based on the accounts of someone now deceased. I need to remind everyone here that any physical manipulation of a neurologically compromised patient can cause nerve damage or trigger severe complications." Sarah nodded, arms folded, as if affirming his every word. Michael didn't speak at first. He walked over to his mother. Evelyn was watching him. Her eyes were not bright, not youthful, but they were firm, present, anchored. He bent down, took her hand in both of his. "Mom, do you want Emily to continue?" There was a pause, not long, but long enough to make the room hold still. Then Evelyn's lips moved. "Continue." Clear, certain. Reed watched them. His face didn't shift much, but something in his eyes flickered a war between professional skepticism and the quiet pull of something harder to define. He didn't argue. But as he turned to go, stepping out into the golden light slanting down the hallway, he left them with one final sentence. "Sometimes people see what they want to see. Hope is powerful. But it isn't always right." And then he left, closing the door behind him and leaving a room where logic and feeling had just collided, neither yielding entirely to the other. But in Michael's heart, there was no question. Not anymore. Not after watching Evelyn speak, choose, respond. Not after watching Emily stand quietly in the face of doubt. What he felt now was not hesitation. It was certainty. Evelyn was coming back. And Emily, this quiet, steadfast girl, with a notebook and a memory full of hands that healed, was the bridge that carried her back to the world. That afternoon, after Dr. Reed left, the house fell into a hush, as if it had just weathered a storm that left no visible wreckage, but had quietly shifted the direction of the wind. Sarah said nothing. She retreated to her room and slammed the door behind her, leaving in her wake a long hallway echoing with the groan of old wood. In the kitchen, Linda continued preparing dinner, her hands moving with practiced rhythm, though her eyes kept drifting toward Emily, who sat beside Evelyn, quietly writing something into a new notebook. No one spoke. The house, heavy with silence, felt suspended, as though waiting to see what would unfold next. And in that silence, something began to build, not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable. A quiet kind of resistance was taking shape. Michael entered his mother's room just as dinner was nearly ready. Evelyn sat in her wheelchair, eyes open, gazing out the window where the last light of day fell over the lavender garden, faded but not lifeless. Emily sat at her feet, silent, her small hand resting lightly on Evelyn's thin arm, as though ready to offer her warmth through touch alone if it were ever needed. Michael knelt down and took his mother's hand in his. "I'm sorry about today," he said gently. "I didn't expect Sarah to react like that." Evelyn said nothing. But her eyes, though quiet, were not distant. She knew, she heard, and she had chosen not to speak. But she also had not turned away. That was always her way, quiet, but unwavering. Sarah appeared at dinner, holding a thin folder in her hand. She placed it on the table like a declaration that needed no voice. "I'm filing a request to reassess Mom's legal capacity," she said, cool and clipped. "And if necessary, I'll petition to suspend all unofficial intervention from outside parties." Michael looked up, setting his chopsticks down. "You mean Emily?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. "She's not qualified, and what you're doing might only worsen things if this is just a terminal surge." Linda's hands stiffened, but she said nothing. Emily didn't look up from her notebook. No one raised their voice. No one pounded the table. There were no tears. Just a meal where silence became its own kind of statement. And for the first time, defiance didn't come in words, but through presence, through the way Michael held the spoon and leaned in to feed his mother, through the way Evelyn swallowed each slow spoonful, without resistance, without turning away, through the way Emily stayed where she was, not flinching, not retreating. It was a quiet revolt, a dinner not of arguments, but of choices. And each gesture, each glance, each deliberate act of care said more than any document on the table ever could. That night, as shadows stretched across the wooden floors and the house settled into quiet, Linda spoke softly to Michael. She told him what she'd seen earlier, in the moment when Emily had stepped out briefly to fetch a warm towel. "She reached for her," Linda said, her voice lower than usual. Not much, but it was clear. Her hand trembled, and she watched the girl like she was afraid she wouldn't come back. Michael sat in the old armchair, still, the image settling deep inside him. A mother who for so long had seemed lost to the world, now reacting to the presence of a 12-year-old girl with a notebook and a calm, steady voice. And no doctor could explain it. There was no need to. Evelyn was speaking in her own language now, through her eyes, through the slow flutter of lashes, the tilt of her head toward familiar sounds. And tonight, through silence itself, as Sarah's voice rose with opposition, and Evelyn chose not to respond. The next morning, Sarah didn't come down for breakfast. Instead, she left a note on the kitchen table. In it was a scheduled meeting with an attorney, along with copies of their mother's medical records. Michael read it quietly, then set it aside without a word. He looked toward the living room, where Evelyn sat by the window with Emily. The girl had found an old record player in the storage room and now held it delicately in her lap. She placed a worn vinyl disc onto the turntable, turned the crank, and soon the room filled with the soft, smoky tones of an old jazz melody Evelyn had once adored. At the sound, Evelyn closed her eyes. And then, almost imperceptibly, her finger began to tap, gently, slowly, in rhythm, on the armrest of her wheelchair. Michael saw it. Linda saw it. None of them spoke. But in that small moment, everything was said. Resistance had met its quiet answer. No arguments, no declarations. Evelyn had chosen. And the house would follow that choice, despite folders of paperwork, legal threats, or the cold precision of doubt. Because there are kinds of life that don't need lab results to be real. A single finger tapping to a forgotten tune is enough to say to the world, "I am still here." That morning, the house wore a stillness as thick as fog not yet burned away. Sarah had left early. Michael had heard the soft growl of the engine reversing down the gravel drive, the crunch of tires over damp stone. She left behind a brief, handwritten note placed beside the tea kettle. Asterisk, "I will return with a final decision." Asterisk, "No farewell, no promise of return." just the calculated finality of someone who once belonged, but now felt like a visitor in a home that had begun to breathe again. Linda said nothing. She poured tea as always, but her movements were slower, more deliberate. Emily arrived as she did every morning, a small canvas bag over her shoulder, her notebook tucked inside alongside several carefully rolled strips of cloth. But this morning, what struck Michael wasn't her constancy, it was his own readiness. He felt no hesitation, no guardedness. He was no longer watching. He was choosing to move forward. When he stepped into the living room, Evelyn was sitting by the window, bathed in soft morning light. Michael knelt before her and took her hand in his. It was still thin, still fragile, but it held warmth. And in every gentle squeeze, there was something alive that he could no longer deny. Emily settled beside them, opening her notebook and whispering something to Evelyn. Then she turned to Michael, her voice calm but firm. "I want to start working on basic reflex training, but this time you'll help me." Michael hesitated. "Me?" Emily nodded. "She needs someone close by, someone she trusts. If she sees that you trust me, she'll allow herself to go further." He looked at his mother. Evelyn didn't speak, but her eyes never left his. They were waiting not for his words, but for what he would do next. He nodded, quietly, fully. And just like that, a new beginning took its place in the silence. For nearly an hour that morning, the three of them, a mother, a child, and a grown son, sat bathed in soft sunlight in the living room, practicing movements so small they might have seemed meaningless to anyone else. Emily placed her palm gently on Evelyn's knee, applying light pressure to each point, one at a time. Michael stood behind his mother, helping her keep her back straight, whispering encouragements in a voice meant not to lead but to support. There were no loud noises, no sudden breakthroughs, no dramatic signs of transformation. And yet, something was unmistakably present. Evelyn did not resist. She didn't pull away. She didn't look away. And on the fourth repetition, when Emily placed her hand on Evelyn's right ankle, the miracle happened. That foot twitched, just a little, a flicker no stronger than a reflex. But this time, Michael saw it, clearly. No longer imagination, no longer hope disguised as perception. He turned to Emily. Their eyes met in a silent agreement, like an invisible handshake. "Continue," Evelyn whispered. Her voice was weak but firm. No one spoke after that. They simply did what she asked. In the days that followed, this quiet rhythm became the new life of the Walker house. Mornings began with music to awaken Evelyn's joints. Emily brought the small record player and played old jazz tunes or soft Chopin pieces Evelyn had once played herself in the stillness of early evenings. Afternoons were for simple exercises, starting from raising a wrist to rotating an ankle. Michael learned to observe not just with his eyes, but with his whole being. He learned to hear his mother's breath, feel the slight tremor in her limbs, understand a sigh not as fatigue, but as communication. And every time Evelyn completed a movement, Emily carefully recorded it in her notebook, handwriting each word with deliberate strokes, as though every line of ink was part of a growing miracle. One day, as Michael was gently wiping his mother's feet with a warm cloth, Evelyn placed her hand on his shoulder. Not forcefully, not for long, but long enough to stop him in place. He looked up. She smiled faintly and said, "Just like your father." His vision blurred. It had been so long since he'd heard her speak of his dad, the man she had loved without hesitation, whose memory once filled every corner of this house. But now, that memory hadn't come as a wistful recollection. It came through her breath, her voice, her return. This wasn't nostalgia. It was proof. Evelyn was truly finding her way back. That evening, as Linda set the table, Michael added another chair. It was no longer out of politeness or habit. He believed deeply that the day would come, and soon, when Evelyn would sit there again, not as someone needing to be served, but as a living presence at the table. Emily sat by the window, her eyes distant, but her face quietly glowing with the kind of certainty only children and the very old sometimes carry. As Michael walked past, she spoke softly, as if reminding him of something sacred. "She's choosing to live again. Our job is not to stop halfway." Michael paused, then nodded. Not like a man doing the right thing, but like a son who had finally found his way to being the kind of son he was meant to be. And this time, he would see it through. That afternoon, the last light of day stretched like warm honey across the front steps, slipping softly through the worn linen curtains. In the living room, Evelyn sat quietly in her wheelchair, hands resting lightly on her lap, eyes turned toward the window where sunlight poured over the fading lavender garden. Across from her sat Emily, empty-handed, no notebook, no cloth bandages, no tools. Only a single question, spoken gently into the stillness of the room. "Would you like to try standing?" Evelyn turned her head toward Michael, then back to Emily. No one rushed her. No one urged her forward. In the girl's gaze was something unwavering, not pressure, not expectation, but belief. A pure, quiet invitation, a chance. Michael knelt beside his mother, resting his hand on the armrest. "I'm right here, Mum. I'll steady you." In the corner, Linda stood frozen, still holding a half-folded tablecloth, her eyes locked on Evelyn. No one dared breathe deeply. The room itself seemed to pause, clearing space for the one thing that now mattered most, a decision. Evelyn didn't speak, but her fingers tightened around the armrest. A single motion. Subtle, yet it made the air tremble. Emily stepped closer, placing both hands gently over Evelyn's knees, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll hold your knees. You just need to believe in your legs again. Just a little." Evelyn looked down. At the legs that had once carried her through concert halls and staircases, through laughter and sorrow, through every corner of the life she had built in this very house, they felt distant now, like strangers. But somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the doubt, a thread had never snapped. A memory stirred. A movement began. Her grip on the armrests tightened. She leaned forward. Michael reached for her elbow, not to lift her, only to steady her. Evelyn's brow furrowed. Her mouth drew tight. And slowly, with the last reservoirs of strength, she shifted her weight onto her feet. One foot trembled, then the other. Her body lifted slowly, unsteadily, but unmistakably. No one held her up. Evelyn was standing, not tall, not fully straight, but by her own will. Linda's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling without permission. Emily stayed in place, her hands still at Evelyn's knees, her lips pressed together as if holding a silent prayer. Michael could hardly breathe. His eyes were wide, his voice cracked as the words escaped. "Mum, you're standing." Evelyn held herself there for nearly 10 seconds. 10 seconds that stretched into eternity for the three of them. Then her knees gave slightly, and Michael caught her. He didn't let her fall. He sank down with her, arms around her like a child held close. "You did it. You really did it." Emily stepped back, giving the moment its rightful space. But Linda moved forward, wiping her tears and placing a steady hand on the girl's shoulder. "You kept your promise," she said, voice full of awe. Emily looked up at her. "I only opened the door. She chose to walk through." The words struck something deep in Michael. He held his mother tighter. In that embrace was the release of months of helplessness, of sleepless nights, of wondering whether too much time had passed to hope. But it turned out it only took one step. Not a perfect step. Not a long one. Just a real one. One that belonged entirely to Evelyn. And she had taken it. That evening, dinner unfolded in an unusual silence. not the kind born from discomfort, but one too full for words. No one spoke much, as if language itself had stepped aside, unable to capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. Evelyn was wheeled to the table, but for the first time, she didn't slump passively into the chair. She sat taller. Her eyes were clearer. And when Michael brought the spoon to her lips, she reached out with both hands to take it. Her hands still trembled, but she didn't need to be held. Linda wept again, this time without restraint. "I haven't seen her like this since her husband passed," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Emily looked over at Michael. He met her gaze with a quiet nod. His eyes no longer held the worn, detached fatigue of a man buried beneath schedules and responsibility. They held something deeper. The gaze of a son who had recovered something sacred, not a possession, not an achievement, but a part of himself. A part called Time's mother, asterisk. After everyone left the table, Michael lingered. He walked over to the wheelchair, bent to fold the small seat blanket, and for the first time noticed how small it seemed. Then he looked toward Evelyn, still seated beneath the soft yellow light. She nodded gently. No words were needed. Everything had been said. She had begun her return one step, one fragile moment at a time. That first step, though shaky, had become the foundation for something that few dared to name, a miracle. Not one brought by sudden flashes or divine interventions, but one born of stubborn, steady love. A miracle wrapped in patience, a miracle that began with a single silent act of rising. And that was everything. The next morning, the skies over Asheville were impossibly clear, as if nature itself sensed that something had shifted within the old house, nestled among the pines. Michael opened the windows, letting the scent of trees and morning light drift into every corner. The living room, where Evelyn had once laid in stillness for endless months, was now the quiet stage of daily resurrection. She didn't just sit taller now, she kept her eyes open longer, and her fingers had begun to move, softly, rhythmically, as though tapping out a melody only she could hear. Emily arrived as always, but this morning she brought something different. Not her notebook, not warm towels or cotton wraps. She brought a pair of soft cloth shoes, once white, now faded to a gentle ivory with time. Michael recognized them instantly. They were the shoes Evelyn used to wear during her early spring walks through the garden. Emily placed them carefully at Evelyn's feet without a word. Then she sat beside her, taking her hand. "I've finished reading my grandfather's journal," she said quietly. "He wrote that recovery isn't just about muscles, it's about belief. Every muscle in the body is a living memory. And if someone touches the right place with love, the body remembers its way back." Evelyn looked down at the shoes, then up at Michael. He nodded, unable to speak as emotions swelled in his chest. "I think you're ready, Mom." Emily looked at them both, then took a deep breath. "I made a promise," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and today I want to say it again, but all the way." She placed Evelyn's hand gently on her own chest. "I once told you I could help you walk again. Not because I'm special, but because I believe in what others have given up on. I believe that when people are seen with love, they find their way back to themselves." Michael stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking into him. Behind the kitchen door, Linda placed a hand over her heart, as if steadying it against everything that was rising inside her. Evelyn didn't speak, but her tears fell quietly, gently, like an autumn stream finding its path through dry stone. Emily went on, her voice now steady despite the tremble underneath. "I don't promise you'll run like you used to. I don't promise it'll be easy, but I promise I'll be here, every day, every step, until your legs remember they belong to a woman who once walked without fear. And I won't stop. Not even if everyone else does." Michael turned away to wipe his eyes. He had never heard a promise so beautiful, and never imagined it would come from a 12-year-old girl. Evelyn lifted her hand and touched Emily's cheek. Then she turned to Michael. Her voice was soft, but sure. "My son, you brought me something no doctor ever could. Someone who believed I could live again." Michael knelt beside her, arms around her. "No, Mum." You walked toward that. Emily only opened the door. "But you're the one who stepped through it." From the corner of the room, Linda approached, taking her daughter's hand in hers. "You make me proud," she whispered. Emily looked at her mother, then at Michael, then at Evelyn. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her eyes were already shining with trust, with loyalty, and with a quiet bravery that belonged not to her age, but to her spirit. That night, after everyone had gone upstairs, Michael stood by the window, gazing out at the garden where, tomorrow, Evelyn would try to take a few more steps in her old shoes. A hush had settled over the house, the kind that came not from emptiness, but from deep, reverent stillness. He felt lighter than he had in years. Not the lightness that followed success, or even rest, but something more profound, a quiet release from the constant need to control, to conquer, to always know. For so long he had believed that strength came from power, from certainty. But now, standing there in the dim light, watching the shadows stretch over lavender and soft earth, he understood. True strength was this, daring to believe in the most fragile things. A whisper, a glance, a trembling first step, and most of all, a promise made by a 12-year-old girl, strong enough to hold together a world that had nearly collapsed. In the silence of the evening, Michael closed his eyes, listened to the wind moving gently through the garden, and knew tomorrow would be a day worth living. 3 days after Emily's promise, a gold-trimmed envelope arrived at the Walker house, its arrival a quiet disruption in the calm, steady rhythm they had built together. Michael received it while helping Evelyn along the hallway with the aid of a walking belt and support braces. Emily walked behind, softly counting steps, whispering encouragement that only Evelyn could hear. Linda was in the kitchen preparing lunch, while early autumn sunlight filtered through the curtains in long, golden stripes across the wooden floor. The envelope stood out amid all this peace, like a messenger from another world, a world Michael had once belonged to, where pressure and prestige clung to every breath. He opened it and read quickly, his eyes scanning the thick paper embossed with subtle, expensive ink. It was an invitation to a gala honoring major healthcare investors, held in New York at a 5-star hotel overlooking Central Park, a place that had once marked his triumphant return after a landmark deal. But it wasn't the event or the prestige that made his hands still. It was the final detail. Honorees were asked to appear with a family member. For Michael, the name printed in elegant type beneath his own was Evelyn Walker. The letter said her presence would be the heart of the evening, a symbol of compassion, of legacy, of what healing truly meant. Michael sat down heavily, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. That evening, during dinner, he read the letter aloud. Linda frowned. Emily turned to Evelyn, her eyes lit with a kind of quiet, wild hope, as if she were waiting for magic to unfold again. And then it was Michael who broke the silence. "I don't think we should go," he said calmly, though there was firmness in his voice. "If you're not ready, Mum, I'll turn it down." Evelyn turned to look at her son. Her gaze held no fear, only a calm, rooted clarity. She pressed her lips together, then spoke, clearly and slowly, "I want to go." The words stopped the air in the room. Linda set her spoon down, hands frozen. Emily leaned back slightly, her mouth parted in disbelief. Michael frowned. "Mom, it's a long trip. There are stairs, bright lights. You don't need to prove anything." Evelyn reached out and touched his hand. "Not to prove, to finish what I started." Later that night, Michael sat with Emily in the living room while Evelyn slept. The girl closed her notebook and looked at him with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. "I know this matters to you," she said quietly, but I think it matters even more to her. Michael didn't ask why. He didn't need to. It wasn't just about an award or a stage. For Evelyn, this was a moment of return not to society, but to herself. The next morning, they began to shift the rhythm of their training. No more cautious steps along the hallway. Emily suggested they move the sessions outside, into the garden. They added handrails, laid down soft mats along the path to soften a fall. Michael stayed by her side for every step, not letting go, not once. Evelyn remained quiet, focused, her lips pressed together in concentration, but her eyes carried a brightness, a glimmer he hadn't seen since he was a child. Since the days she sat at the piano in the living room, playing her way into silence and light. She knew stages. She knew what it meant to step into a spotlight. What she needed now wasn't applause. It was time. And belief. And she had both. 3 days later, Sarah called back. She had already heard about the gala. Her voice on the phone was still cold, but this time there was a hint of hesitation. "Are you really letting Mum go? That could be dangerous." Michael did not lose his temper. He simply answered, his voice low and steady. "She's the one who decides, and you no longer have the right to stop her." Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she spoke softly. "If she's going, let me send her a dress." Michael nodded, as if the space between the two siblings had drawn a little closer, no longer walled off by control or fear. The night before they left Asheville, Emily came by earlier than usual. She brought with her a photo book she had made by hand, filled with drawings and handwritten notes, tracing each step of Evelyn's journey. "You need to remember how far you've come," the girl said, and placed the book gently into Evelyn's hands. Just before they set off, Michael looked at his mother one last time in the mirror. Evelyn was wearing a deep blue dress. Her hair had been brushed and smoothed by Linda. Her lips held a touch of color, and in her eyes was a brightness that took him by surprise. He held her hand and felt the steady rhythm of her pulse. "Are you sure?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. "I've been sitting for far too long. It's time to stand. Really stand." And as the wheelchair rolled gently off the front porch, everyone there understood that no matter what lay ahead, the miracle had already begun right here, born from the unshakable will of that woman, not to step into the light, but to step back into her own life. The drive to New York lasted nearly 10 hours, but no one in the car felt the usual kind of weariness. Evelyn sat still in the back, gazing through the window as the mountain ridges slipped away and the tall buildings rose in their place, her eyes never leaving the scenes unfolding like a slow-motion film. Michael glanced back now and then to check on her, while Emily sat beside her, her hand lightly resting on Evelyn's, which felt warmer and stronger than it had in a long time. Linda drove with focus, but now and then her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, as if quietly confirming that everything was still all right. Resting on Evelyn's lap was the photo book Emily had made, and she turned its pages one by one through the journey. As though each drawing was a shard of memory she needed to etch deep into her soul before the moment of reckoning arrived. That night, they stayed in a hotel near the central square, just steps away from where the gala would take place. The room was spacious, bright, and elegant, yet none of them paid much attention to the furnishings. Every eye was drawn instead to the carpeted floor, the long hallway, and above all, the stretch of path from the wings of the stage to the podium that Evelyn would have to cross the following evening. Michael had already paced it out himself. 20 steps. From the wheelchair to the podium, under the watchful gaze of hundreds, beneath the stark glare of lights that would shine straight into her eyes, where there would be no room for error. No one said it aloud, but all of them knew. If she stumbled, if she fell, everything would end. Not just admiration, but the very trust she had built so carefully over the past many months. And that was why, the next morning, they began the most serious rehearsal yet. Michael brought Evelyn to the empty conference hall. where the organizers had allowed them early access to the stage for a trial run. Emily came prepared with a stopwatch, soft mats, knee braces, and a fresh notebook where she had recorded every detail of their training. She stood before the stage, her voice firm and focused, not unlike that of a military coach. "We're going to walk 20 steps. No more, no less. Each step must be steady. If you're tired, stop, but do not turn back." Evelyn nodded. Her eyes no longer trembled as they once did during their early sessions. Instead, they held a quiet focus, a calm as deep as still water. Emily stood to her left, Michael to her right. Each offered a light touch of support, but did not carry her. Linda stood at the far end of the path, stopwatch and towel in hand, ready if Evelyn needed a break. Evelyn drew in a long breath, then took the first step. That first step was slow, but solid. The second wavered slightly, but held. By the third, her arm lifted instinctively for balance, with no need for a reminder. By the fifth, her posture had grown straighter. Michael glanced at Emily. The girl said nothing, but her fingers clenched around the notebook, her lips pressed tightly together, as if trying to keep her own heartbeat steady. At the 10th step, Evelyn paused. Not from fatigue, but to take a deeper breath. She raised her head and looked at the stage, as if realigning herself with the path ahead. Then she went on. Step 11, step 12. By step 15, her legs began to tremble, but her gaze remained clear. Michael asked softly, "You all right, Mum?" Evelyn gave no answer, only a small but determined nod. At step 18, she swayed slightly, but Emily was ready. The girl stepped forward just half a pace. Not to catch her, only to rest a hand on Evelyn's elbow, a silent message that said, "I'm here." Evelyn gripped the rail more firmly, readjusted her stance. On the 19th step, her whole body leaned forward, but Michael steadied her by the shoulder before she lost balance. Then came the 20th step. Evelyn stood directly in front of the podium, breathing hard, but refusing to sit. Linda rushed to her side and gently wiped the sweat from her brow. Emily stopped the watch, looked up, and said, 8 minutes and 30 seconds. We did it. Michael said nothing. He only lowered his head to rest his forehead gently against his mother's, taking in the warmth of her skin. Evelyn whispered, "Tomorrow will be shorter." Emily laughed softly. "It doesn't have to be shorter, it just has to be yours." That afternoon they didn't rehearse again. Evelyn needed to rest. And more importantly, they all needed to believe that tomorrow would unfold just as it should. That evening, the family sat down to dinner together in silence, a silence that was full of peace. No one spoke about the stage, no one mentioned the 20 steps. Yet in their eyes, it was present, not as a burden, but as something already accepted, embraced, and ready to be faced. Before going to sleep, Emily placed the notebook on the table beside Evelyn's bed. This time, there were no new notes, no drills. The final page held only a single line, handwritten in blue ink, simple and filled with quiet faith. "You won't walk alone. Every step, we walk with you." Evelyn read the line 3 times, then closed her eyes. For the first time in many years, she did not simply sleep, she rested, like someone preparing for a true return. That evening, the Grand Hall in New York shimmered under lights that sparkled like an artificial sky full of stars. The guests were elegantly dressed. Soft music floated in the air, mingling with the scent of expensive perfume and the hush of polite conversation. But backstage, where the light had not yet reached, an elderly woman was preparing for the longest journey of her life. Evelyn Walker sat in her wheelchair, hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead at the stage beyond. Emily stood beside her, both hands holding the knee braces, giving them one last careful check with the precision of a true physician. Michael knelt in front of her, holding her hands in his. He didn't speak, but in his eyes was an entire sky filled with hope and belief. Evelyn's name was called. Applause rose from the crowd. The host introduced her as a symbol of resilience and of a family's enduring love, but none of the audience knew that behind the curtain she was about to attempt something very few had believed possible. Evelyn nodded. Emily released the brake on the wheelchair. Michael steadied her shoulders. Linda stood near the curtain, her eyes wet with emotion. And then the wheelchair came to a stop. Evelyn placed her hands on the armrests. The hall fell into complete silence. No one knew what was about to happen. And then, in the soft golden light, she stood. One step, then another. Each step held the room breathless. By the 10th, someone in the crowd was already in tears. By the 15th, the audience had risen to their feet. When Evelyn reached the 20th step, she stopped at the microphone. There was no one helping her in that moment. It was just her, standing on trembling legs but with unwavering resolve. She took the microphone in her hand. Her voice was hoarse but steady. She said she was not a miracle, not a hero. She was simply a mother who had been given a second chance at life by a young girl who believed in something the grown-ups had long forgotten. She said her son had chosen to believe in what seemed impossible, and because of that, she now stood here, not to be honored, but to truly live again. When Evelyn finished speaking, the hall erupted, not with admiration, but with something deeper, something raw and human. They had just witnessed what, in the quietest part of every soul, we all hope might still be true, that faith can change a fate. That night, they did not simply witness a speech. They witnessed a journey out of darkness. A mother, a son, and a 12-year-old girl had together created a miracle not from magic, but from the unshakable will and a heart that refused to let go. The story of Evelyn Walker is not merely one of illness and recovery. It is a story about daring to believe when everyone else has already given up, about choosing to take the next step even when no one thinks you can, and about a strength that is not measured in years, but in love and in faith. Dear friend, you've just followed a truly special journey here on Emotional Echoes. If this story moved you, if it brought to mind your mother or someone you love who may be holding on for a glimmer of hope, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the stories that reach into the heart every day. How did this journey speak to you? Was there something in Evelyn's story that reminded you of yourself or someone who's touched your life? We would be honored to read your honest reflections in the comments below. Share your thoughts with us so we can listen, connect, and continue to bring you stories filled with humanity and meaning. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish you good health, a life of peace, and a quiet joy that grows with each small step forward. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video here on Emotional Echoes.